In the winter of 1890, when the cold stopped caring who you were, an entire valley in Montana began to fail. Houses burned wood nonstop and still froze. Roofs collapsed under snow. Children slept in coats. Animals died standing. Then, on a wind-scoured hillside no one wanted, one quiet cowboy built a house that refused to lose its heat, even when the cold took lives all around it. Neighbors called it foolish. Some called it dangerous. But when the worst night of winter came, that strange house became the difference between survival and loss. What happens next will make you believe in quiet miracles and second chances for the forgotten. Before we begin, tell me where you are watching from. Drop your country in the comments below, and if you believe no child or animal should ever face fear alone, hit subscribe now and share this story with someone who needs hope. Bitterroot Valley, Montana Territory, late autumn 1890. Bitterroot Valley did not announce winter. It prepared for it quietly, the way an experienced executioner sharpened a blade without ceremony. By late autumn of 1890, the valley floor lay stripped of color, the grasses dulled to a pale gold, the cottonwoods along the creeks already half bare. The mountains to the west carried early snow like a warning that no one argued with. Wind moved through the valley almost constantly, not the erratic gusts of warmer country, but a disciplined, persistent force that traveled the same routes day after day, learning the land as well as any man ever could. It slipped through gaps, climbed slopes, and struck exposed ground with deliberate cruelty. People who lived here built with that wind in mind, even if they didn't always understand it. Hamilton, the small town crouched at the valley's center, looked as though it had been pressed into the earth by years of weather. Boardwalk planks were worn smooth by boots and ice scrapers. Storefronts leaned slightly, as if bracing themselves. Wood smoke clung to the air, mixed with the metallic scent of cold. Men spoke less when winter approached, not out of fear, but out of respect. Silas Crow entered the valley on a gray morning when the wind cut straight through wool and leather. He was 34 years old, tall and lean, built for endurance rather than display. His shoulders were narrow but set, his posture upright in a way that suggested habit rather than pride. His face carried sharp lines shaped by years outdoors, high cheekbones, a long jaw, and a nose that had been broken once and healed imperfectly. A short, dark beard framed his mouth, trimmed for practicality. His hair was nearly black, cut close to his head, already dusted with the first grains of winter. His eyes were gray-green and steady, the kind that evaluated a place before reacting to it. He didn't smile easily, but neither did he scowl. He simply looked and remembered. He rode a roan gelding named Ash, an older horse with a calm temperament and a scarred left hind fetlock that testified to a hard winter long past. Ash moved carefully but without hesitation, placing his hooves as if he knew exactly how much trust the ground deserved. His ears stayed half forward, half back, alert without being anxious. Horse and rider shared an understanding born not of affection, but of reliability. Each knew the other would not ask for more than could be given. Silas carried little with him: a bedroll, a coil of rope, a small set of tools wrapped in canvas, and a wooden chest secured behind the saddle. The chest held papers, measurements, and a pair of old leather gloves whose seams had been repaired more than once. They were not sentimental, but they were necessary. Silas believed in keeping what still worked. He stopped in town only as long as required. He fed Ash, warmed his hands briefly over the stove in the feed store, and walked to the county office without comment. Inside, the clerk looked up from his ledger with the practiced caution of a man accustomed to strangers asking for things that would not end well. Arthur Keene was in his late 40s, thin to the point of fragility, his hair retreating from his temples as if embarrassed to remain. His spectacles rested low on his nose, and his collar seemed perpetually too tight. He trusted records more than instincts, and that trust had kept him employed. "You looking to register cattle or buy land?" Keene asked. "Land," Silas said. Keene reached for a map automatically. "Plenty near the river, better soil, less exposure." Silas shook his head once. "I want to see what hasn't sold." Keene paused, studying him. "Most men ask the opposite." Silas met his gaze evenly. "Most men aren't me." After a moment, Keene sighed and pulled out a thinner ledger. He ran his finger down the page until it stopped. 15 acres, east slope, hard. Ground, no standing timber. Wind exposure severe, no prior construction. Silas leaned forward slightly. That's the one. Keene frowned. You understand why it's still available? I do. The wind comes straight down the mountain, Keene continued, as if obligation required the warning. Snow piles deep. Fences don't last. A house there would take a beating. Silas nodded. That's why I need it. The clerk looked at him for a long second, then wrote out the paperwork. The transaction was simple. Money changed hands. Ink dried. Keene slid the deed across the counter and watched Silas fold it carefully, as though it were a tool rather than a prize. You'll have company, Keene said. People will want to see what kind of man builds there. Silas paused at the door. Let them look. Outside, the wind had strengthened. Silas mounted Ash and followed a narrowing track out of town, past ranch fences and low sheds built tight against the land. The farther he rode, the less protected the ground became. Trees thinned, the wind lost what little obstruction it had and struck full force. The land waited. The 15 acres lay on a shallow rise that caught every current sweeping down the valley. The soil was pale and stubborn, broken by stones pushed upward by years of frost. Grass grew thin and low, flattened where winter had already tested it. Silas stopped at the edge of the lot and remained mounted, scanning the ground without haste. He watched how the wind crossed the slope, where it accelerated, where it bent and twisted. He noted a shallow depression on the leeward side where snow would gather and a line of sage that disrupted the air just enough to offer relief. Ash drifted instinctively toward that line and stood with his body angled to reduce exposure. Silas observed this without comment. Animals noticed what men often ignored. He dismounted and walked the perimeter slowly, measuring distance with his stride. He scraped the ground with his boot heel, testing the hardness beneath the top layer. He picked up stones, turned them, set them back down. This was not curiosity. It was assessment. A rider approached from below, climbing steadily. Silas heard the horse before he saw it. He turned as the woman reined in at a respectful distance. Sarah Lindholm sat her saddle with quiet authority. She was in her late 30s, broad-shouldered, strong-backed, dressed for work rather than display. Her dark wool coat was belted tight, her gloves worn smooth at the palms. Copper-brown hair was braided neatly down her back, and her skin showed the weathering of long days outdoors. A thin scar cut through her left eyebrow, pale against sun-darkened skin. Her expression was open but guarded, the look of someone who had learned to judge situations quickly. Didn't expect to see anyone up here, she said. Silas faced her. Same. She glanced at the land, then back to him. You buy this? Yes. Her mouth tightened briefly. This ground breaks houses. Only if they're built wrong. Sarah studied him more closely now. The scars on his hands, the careful trim of his beard, the calm set of his shoulders. You got a crew? No. You got timber? No. She exhaled sharply. Then you're either brave or foolish. Silas shrugged. That depends on the design. Sarah dismounted and walked a short distance, testing the wind with her hand. People here build square, she said. Heavy walls, big fireplaces, fight the cold head on. And lose, Silas replied quietly. She turned to look at him. You sound sure. I've buried men who weren't. That stopped her. She nodded once. Then listen to this. Don't face your door north. Don't set your foundation shallow, and don't let anyone talk you into building for tradition instead of survival. Silas inclined his head. I won't, she remounted. My ranch is down valley. If you need supplies or advice, ask for me. Thank you. As she rode away, the wind filled the space she left. Silas returned his attention to the land. He walked to the center of the lot and knelt, pressing his palm flat against the cold ground. It was unforgiving, but honest. He stood slowly, his expression unchanged. In his mind, the house had already begun, not with walls or roof, but with a foundation shaped to remember heat, walls curved to guide wind rather than resist it, and earth pulled close to share its warmth. People would call it foolish. They always did, before winter taught them otherwise. Silas took Ash's reins and led him toward the line of sage. The wind howled overhead, but neither man nor horse hurried. The building would begin where it always should, not above ground, not for appearances, but where survival started. Silas Crow began building before anyone would have recognized the work as construction. There were no rising walls, no visible frame, nothing that satisfied the valley's idea of progress. From a distance, it looked as though he was merely pacing the land, wearing narrow paths into the grass like a restless animal. In truth, he was mapping forces that could not be seen. The wind had patterns, and Silas treated those patterns the way other men treated property lines or blood ties, as facts that would not bend to optimism. Each morning, he rode out before the sun fully cleared the mountains, the cold sharp enough to sting the inside of his nose. Ash followed the same route without guidance, hooves finding stable ground even when frost slicked the stones. Silas dismounted near the center of the lot and planted short stakes in the soil, marking where the wind accelerated, where it dropped, where it spun briefly before moving on. He tied scraps of cloth to the stakes, old shirt tails, bits of sacking, and watched how they moved throughout the day. By afternoon, the cloths told a story more honest than any blueprint. Straight lines flapped violently. Curved placements survived with less strain. On the third day, Silas put a shovel into the ground. The soil resisted immediately. The top layer gave way with effort, but beneath it lay a compacted mix of clay and stone that rang dull when struck. This was not earth that wanted to be moved. Silas adjusted his stance, slowed his rhythm, and worked the shovel like a lever rather than a blade. He paused often, not from fatigue, but to study how the ground fractured under pressure. He was not digging a hole. He was negotiating with the land. Ash stood nearby, head lowered, breath puffing in slow white clouds. Occasionally the horse shifted his weight to ease his bad leg, then settled again. He had learned that Silas did not quit a task once begun. There was no sense worrying over it. By the end of the week, a shallow, oval depression had taken shape, not deep enough yet to be called a foundation, but deliberate in its proportions. It was longer east to west, narrower north to south, its edges sloped rather than cut. Snow that fell during the night collected unevenly, drifting deeper along the northern rim while leaving the southern edge relatively bare. Silas noted this with quiet satisfaction. It was then that the valley began to notice him in earnest. The first to ride up uninvited was Thomas Calder, a man of about 40 with a thick chest and the posture of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Calder wore a heavy beard, black and untrimmed, streaked prematurely with gray. His coat was expensive but worn hard, and his hat sat low over a pair of sharp brown eyes that missed little. He owned one of the larger cattle spreads in the lower valley and carried himself accordingly. Years earlier, a blizzard had taken half his herd in a single night, and since then he had trusted nothing that did not look solid enough to punch back. Calder reined in and watched Silas work for several minutes before speaking. "You planning to bury yourself out here?" Silas leaned on his shovel, breathing evenly. "I'm building a foundation." Calder snorted. "Looks like a grave." Silas did not rise to the bait. "Graves are straight," he said. "This isn't." Calder swung down from his saddle and walked the edge of the excavation, boots crunching on frost. He crouched, pressed a hand to the exposed soil, then stood again. "You're wasting time," he said. "You should be setting posts before the ground freezes solid." "I want it frozen," Silas replied. "It tells me where it moves." Calder frowned. "That don't make sense." Silas met his gaze calmly. "It doesn't have to." The rancher stared at him another moment, then shook his head. "You won't last the winter building like this," he said. "A house needs corners, needs weight, needs to stand up to a fight." Silas returned to his work. "Winter doesn't fight fair." Calder mounted again, irritation written plainly across his face. "You'll see," he said, and rode off, leaving churned frost and doubt in his wake. Silas did not watch him go. He had already returned to shaping the ground. As the days shortened, the work deepened. Silas hauled stones from a dry creek bed nearly half a mile away, selecting them carefully. Smooth river rock, heavy but manageable, each one chosen for its ability to hold warmth. He loaded them onto a simple sled rigged from scrap timber and dragged them back behind Ash, who leaned into the traces with stoic patience. The horse's breath steamed, his muscles shifting beneath his hide, but he did not balk. He had pulled heavier loads under worse conditions. Silas set the stones into the earth by hand, fitting them together like pieces of a problem he had solved long ago. He packed clay between them, tamped it down, then, layered more stone, working inward from the edges. This was not a foundation meant to impress. It was meant to remember heat, to resist movement, to stay when everything else fled. One afternoon, as the sky flattened into a hard, pale sheet and the wind sharpened, Silas noticed movement at the far edge of the lot. A dog trotted toward him, medium-sized, long-legged, with a coat the color of old wheat. One ear stood upright, the other folded slightly at the tip. The dog stopped a few yards away and sat, tail resting on the ground, watching with open curiosity. Silas straightened slowly. The dog did not retreat. "Well," Silas said, voice low, "you're not afraid." The dog tilted its head. Silas crouched and extended a hand, palm down. After a moment's consideration, the dog approached and sniffed, then allowed a brief scratch behind the ear. The animal's ribs showed faintly beneath its coat, but its eyes were bright, not feral, just unclaimed. "You belong to someone?" Silas asked, knowing the dog would not answer. The dog wagged its tail once, uncertainly. Silas looked around. No rider followed. He returned to his work, and the dog remained, settling near the edge of the pit where the wind was less aggressive. By dusk, the dog was still there. Silas shared a strip of dried meat without ceremony. The dog accepted it gently and lay down. He did not name it. Not yet. A few days later, Sarah Lindholm returned. She rode up at midday, her bay mare snorting at the cold. Sarah dismounted and took in the sight with an appraising eye, the deepened excavation, the stonework taking shape, the dog lifting its head but not rising. "You're serious?" she said. Silas nodded. "Always was." She walked the perimeter, boots crunching softly. "This isn't how anyone builds here." "That's the point." Sarah crouched and pressed her hand to the stones. "You're thinking about heat before walls." "I'm thinking about survival before comfort." She looked up at him. "People are talking." "They were always going to." She stood, brushed dirt from her gloves. "Calder says you're digging your own end." Silas allowed himself a faint smile. "Calder believes in fighting weather. I believe in outlasting it." Sarah's expression shifted. Less skepticism now, more calculation. "You'll need help hauling stone once the snow comes heavier." "I know." "I can spare a man or two some days," she said. "Not because I think you're right, because I want to see if you are." Silas inclined his head. "Fair enough." She glanced at the dog. "That one yours?" "Seems to think so." Sarah smiled briefly. "Careful," she said. "First a dog, then the whole valley." As she rode away, the dog stood and watched her go, then settled again near Silas's work. Ash flicked an ear in mild disapproval at the newcomer, but said nothing. That night, the temperature dropped sharply. Silas built no fire. There was no shelter yet to hold it. He slept wrapped in his bedroll beside the excavation, his back to the earth. The dog curled near his legs. The ground radiated a faint, stubborn cold, but it was steady, predictable. He preferred that to the deceptive warmth of open air. By morning, frost rimed the stones, and the dog's breath formed small clouds as it rose and shook itself. Silas stood, stiff but alert, and looked at the foundation taking shape. It was not impressive. It would not stop anyone in town from laughing, but it was right. Winter would come whether invited or not. Silas intended to meet it with a house that understood the land better than the men who doubted him, and that understanding began here, beneath the wind, where no one else thought to look. The first snow arrived sideways, thin and sharp, carried on a wind that seemed intent on proving every skeptic right. It dusted the valley without ceremony, whitening fence rails and softening the land just enough to make men uneasy. Silas Crow woke before dawn, the dog lifting its head beside him, as if summoned by the same instinct. Ash stood tethered nearby, tail to the wind, patient and unimpressed. The foundation lay before Silas like a quiet argument already half won, stones locked into the earth, clay packed hard, the oval shape unmistakable now. This was no longer an idea. It was a beginning. Silas did not raise walls the way men expected. He did not set posts in straight lines or square corners to please the eye. Instead, he laid out curved sills along the edge of the foundation, shaping them from heavy timbers he had hauled down from the ridge with Ash's steady pull. Each beam bore the marks of hand tools, adze cuts and saw kerfs, evidence of work done slowly and with intent. He steamed the timbers in a shallow trench covered with canvas and heated stones, coaxing them into a gentle arc rather than forcing them to break. When the wood cooled, it held its shape like a memory that refused to fade. This was when the valley's curiosity hardened into scrutiny. Two men arrived together one afternoon, drawn by rumor and a desire to see failure up close. The first was Elias Mercer, a carpenter in his early 50s, with a chest like a barrel and forearms thick with corded muscle. His beard was iron gray and worn long, his hands scarred by decades of honest mistakes corrected the hard way. He had lost a brother years earlier when a poorly braced roof collapsed under snow, and since then he trusted straight lines and heavy loads more than innovation. The second was Jonah Pike, younger and quieter, with sandy hair and a nervous habit of rubbing his jaw when thinking. Jonah apprenticed under Mercer and had learned to respect tradition because tradition kept him fed. They dismounted and stood for a long moment, taking in the curve of the sills. Mercer broke the silence. "You can't hang walls on air," he said, voice rough but not unkind. Silas wiped his hands on his trousers. "I'm not." Mercer walked the edge, boot heels thudding against packed clay. He crouched, pressed a hand against the timber, and frowned. "These'll rack in a hard wind." "Straight ones will," Silas replied. "These won't give the wind a corner to grab." Jonah tilted his head, studying the arc. "Never seen anything like it." "You have," Silas said. "Just not standing still. Think of a river stone." Mercer snorted. "Stones don't have to hold a roof." "They hold mountains," Silas said, evenly. The carpenter's eyes narrowed. He straightened and folded his arms. "You're building a shell," he said. "That means your load paths better be honest." "They are," Silas replied. He pointed to the foundation. "Weight travels down and out. The curve spreads it. No single joint takes the punishment." Mercer considered this, the way a man considered a stubborn horse, skeptical but unwilling to dismiss what might work. "You'll need ribs," he said. "Close set, tied well." Silas nodded. "Already planned." Mercer grunted. "Then you're either smarter than you look or about to learn a painful lesson." Silas smiled faintly. "I've learned most of mine already." They stayed longer than expected, watching as Silas set the first rib, arched timber rising from the sill like the beginning of a spine. He braced it carefully, checking plumb not by habit but by balance, sighting the curve against the horizon. When the rib stood on its own, Jonah let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "That'll shed wind," Jonah said quietly. Mercer said nothing, but he did not laugh. As the ribs multiplied, the structure began to announce itself. From a distance, it looked less like a house and more like a living thing emerging from the ground, low, rounded, stubbornly unsquare. Snow slid off its flanks instead of piling. Wind met it and moved on, robbed of leverage. Silas worked from dawn to dusk, his movements economical, his focus unwavering. The dog, now clearly his, though still unnamed, followed him from task to task, settling where the wind was kindest. Its coat thickened with the cold, wheat-colored fur, catching frost along the guard hairs. It was young, perhaps 2 years old, quick-eyed and attentive without being needy. It learned the shape of the land as Silas did. Sarah Lindholm returned with help as promised. She brought along a ranch hand named Peter Holt, a man in his late 20s with a narrow face, dark stubble, and the cautious optimism of someone who had not yet been taught to expect disappointment. Peter had lost his parents to fever as a boy and learned early to take direction well. He listened more than he spoke and lifted what he was told without complaint. They hauled timbers, steadied ribs, and packed earth against the lower walls as Silas directed. The work was heavy but purposeful. With each layer of earth added, the structure settled deeper into the land, borrowing its stability and warmth. Silas insisted on compacting every lift thoroughly, explaining little, correcting often. Sarah watched, hands on hips, eyes sharp. "You're building into the hill," she said. "I'm building with it," Silas replied. By midweek, the walls reached a height that suggested shelter rather than theory. Silas sheathed the exterior with overlapping boards laid horizontally, each one slightly angled to guide water and snow away. Over that, he stretched tarred felt, sealing seams with pitch warmed in a small iron pot. The smell of it, sharp and resinous, hung in the cold air. This was not beauty. This was insurance. The valley sent another test before the roof was finished. A windstorm tore. Threw Bitterroot one night with a violence that rattled windows in town. Fences failed. Loose boards vanished into darkness. Silas stayed awake, checking bracing by lantern light, listening to the wind argue with the shape he had given it. The ribs flexed slightly, then settled. The curve did its work. At dawn, he found drift lines where snow had traced the wind's path, but the structure stood unchanged. Mercer rode up again that morning, beard crusted with frost. He walked around the shell twice without speaking, then placed a hand flat against the wall. "It didn't complain," he said. Silas shook his head. "It listened." Mercer exhaled slowly. "I lost my brother because a roof didn't listen," he said. The words were not an accusation. They were a confession. "If you need hands for the roof beams, you ask." Silas met his gaze and nodded. "I will." The roof went on in sections, arched beams tied together and layered with decking that followed the curve, rather than fighting it. Silas kept the pitch low and continuous, eliminating peaks where heat would gather and escape. When the final section was secured, the structure felt complete in a way that surprised even him. Not finished, but whole. That evening, as light faded early and the temperature dropped, Silas built the first small fire inside, not for warmth, but for testing. Smoke moved as intended, drawn steadily through a temporary vent, then gone. The walls held. The ground beneath the stone foundation absorbed the day's residual heat and returned it slowly, a quiet exchange. The dog curled near the wall and slept. Ash stood just outside, choosing the lee side without prompting. Sarah lingered at the doorway, watching the way the interior felt different, still cold but less hostile. "People are going to argue with this," she said. "They already are," Silas replied. She smiled slightly. "Good. Means you're ahead of them." When she left, Silas sat alone and listened to the wind pass over the roof like water over a stone. He thought of the valley's straight houses and sharp corners, of the way men fought winter with bulk and bravado. This place would fight differently. It would not fight at all. Outside, snow began again, softer this time. Silas closed his eyes and allowed himself a rare certainty. The walls were right. The wind had said so. By the time the walls were sealed and the roof stood complete, Bitterroot Valley had settled into the kind of cold that did not fluctuate. It deepened instead, day by day, like a held breath that refused to release. Snow no longer fell in polite layers. It arrived in weight, pressed down by wind, packed hard against anything that dared interrupt its path. The curved shell of Silas Crow's house sat half-buried now, earth banked deliberately against its lower walls, the structure neither defiant nor submissive, simply present, as though it had always belonged to that slope. Silas turned his attention inward. A house that could guide wind and hold snow meant nothing if its heat behaved foolishly. He had seen too many winters squandered by men who built great roaring fires only to watch warmth flee straight up the chimney. Heat, Silas believed, was like a skittish animal. Chase it, and it ran. Give it a place to settle, and it stayed. The heart of this house would not be large. It would be precise. He began by clearing the center of the interior, measuring distance not by rule alone but by feel. The curve of the walls directed space inward, and Silas marked the point where air naturally seemed to pause before circulating again. This was where heat would matter most. He laid stone there first, smooth river rocks set tightly together, their surfaces dulled by centuries of water and pressure. These stones were heavy in the hand and slow to change, which was exactly what he wanted. Ash watched from outside, head lowered, steam-charred breath steady. The dog, still unnamed though clearly settled, paced the perimeter inside, nails clicking softly against stone before choosing a spot near the wall where the cold seemed less insistent. Its coat had grown thicker now, the wheat color darkened by dust and soot, eyes alert but calm. It was young, perhaps not yet 3, with a lean build meant for endurance rather than speed. It had learned the boundaries of the house, quickly, and respected them. Silas mixed clay and sand in careful ratios, adding chopped straw for strength. He worked slowly, packing the mortar by hand, feeling its resistance, adjusting without writing anything down. The valley had no patience for formulas divorced from touch. He laid the first course of fire brick with deliberate care, setting the combustion chamber smaller than anyone expected. Men believed big fires made warm houses. Silas knew better. Big fires made smoke and waste. This was not a fireplace. It was a heater. Word traveled faster than Silas anticipated. The shape of the house had already unsettled people. The idea of a fire built to burn hot and fast, then go dark, unsettled them more. Elias Mercer arrived again on the second day of construction, drawn less by doubt now than by professional obligation. He stood in the doorway, shoulders filling the frame, gray beard dusted with frost. "That's all the bigger you're making it?" Mercer asked, nodding. Toward the combustion chamber. Silas did not look up. "It's enough." Mercer stepped inside, boots scraping lightly. He crouched, inspecting the channels Silas had begun to lay beyond the firebox, narrow passages that twisted through stone and brick like a deliberate maze. "You're sending the heat away from the fire," he said. "I'm slowing it down," Silas replied, "giving it time to stay." Mercer ran a thick finger along a brick seam. "You choke this wrong, you'll smoke yourself out." "I won't," Silas said. "The draw is calculated." Mercer straightened, studying Silas's face for signs of guesswork. He found none. "My brother's stove burned all night," he said quietly. Still froze. Silas finally met his eyes. "Then it burned for the wrong reason." Mercer exhaled through his nose. "You always talk like that?" "Only when it matters." Mercer stayed longer than planned, handing bricks, watching joints close cleanly, saying little. When he left, he paused at the door. "If this works," he said, not turning around, "it changes things." Silas nodded. "It already has." By the time the heater took its final shape, it occupied more mass than space, a compact core of brick and stone that looked unimpressive to the untrained eye. There was no grand hearth, no wide mouth for spectacle. Instead, the channels ran low and long, looping through a bench built along the north interior wall. Silas packed that bench with stone and capped it with thick slabs, creating a place where heat would rest and radiate long after flame disappeared. Sarah Lindholm came at dusk, bringing coffee in a tin and watching quietly as Silas sealed the last joint. She studied the heater with narrowed eyes, arms folded. "That's it?" she asked. "That's it," Silas replied. She raised an eyebrow. "People are expecting something. Louder." Silas wiped his hands. "Loud wastes fuel." Sarah took a sip of coffee and glanced around the interior. The house smelled of clay and stone, raw but clean. The air felt different already, still cold but steady, without the biting edge that moved through most unfinished structures. "When do you light it?" "Tonight." Sarah hesitated. "You want company?" Silas shook his head. "If it fails, I need to know why." She nodded once, understanding more than she said, and left before full dark. Silas waited until the sky outside deepened into iron gray. The wind pressed snow against the curved walls in dull whispers. He loaded the firebox carefully with split pine, stacked to allow air to move freely. He lit it without ceremony and closed the iron door. The fire took immediately. It did not roar outward but inward, drawing hard, flames folding in on themselves with a controlled violence that turned the interior bricks a dull orange. Silas crouched, listening. Not to the sound of burning, but to the draft. It pulled cleanly, steady and purposeful, carrying smoke through the channels Silas had built, forcing heat to linger and transfer rather than escape. The dog lifted its head, ears forward, then settled again. 90 minutes later, the fire was gone. No embers leapt, no smoke lingered. The heater stood warm to the touch, its mass quietly absorbing the work it had been given. Silas sat on the stone bench and waited. Outside, the temperature dropped sharply. The wind gained confidence. Inside, the air changed, not quickly, not dramatically, but steadily, like a held promise being kept. The chill retreated from the center outward, pressed back by radiation rather than force. Heat did not pool at the ceiling or flee toward gaps. It stayed where people lived. Silas slept without feeding the fire. He woke before dawn to a silence that felt unfamiliar. The wind still moved outside, but inside the house it had no voice. The stone bench beneath his hand was warm. The air hovered just below, comfort but far. Above, danger. He built no second fire before stepping outside to check Ash, who stood on the lee side of the house. Snow piled against his flank, but his posture relaxed. Later that morning, Sarah returned, followed by Peter Holt and, unexpectedly, Thomas Calder. Calder looked tired. His beard was rimed with ice, his coat stiff. He did not dismount immediately. "You burned last night?" Calder asked. "Yes." "And this morning?" "No." Calder swung down, walked inside, and stopped. He didn't touch anything at first. He simply stood and felt the air. "That's wrong," he said quietly. Silas leaned against the wall. "It's efficient." Calder pressed his palm to the stone bench, then pulled it back as if surprised. "My place burned through half a cord this week." Silas did not answer. The dog chose that moment to stretch and cross the room, settling near Calder's boots. Calder looked down at it, then back at Silas. "You planning to sell this idea?" Silas shook his head. "I'm planning to survive the winter." Calder huffed a short laugh. "Damn inconvenient." Mercer arrived last, saying nothing as he moved straight to the heater. He crouched, traced the channel path with his eyes, and nodded once. "Fire stayed," he said. "Yes," Silas replied. Mercer stood. "Then the house will." As they left, the valley seemed quieter somehow, as though something fundamental had shifted without announcement. Silas closed the door and leaned briefly against it, feeling the steady warmth at his back. This chapter of the building was done. The house now had a heart, and it remembered. Winter arrived without escalation. There was no warning storm, no dramatic shift that allowed men to prepare their pride. One evening, the air simply hardened, and by morning, Bitterroot Valley had crossed a line it would not recede from for months. The cold settled into the land like an occupying force, methodical, patient, unconcerned with opinion. Snow no longer melted between days. It compacted, layered, and learned the shape of fences and roofs the same way water learned stone. Silas Crow understood this kind of winter. He'd been waiting for it, not with anticipation, but with a quiet readiness that bordered on respect. The house responded exactly as it had been built to respond. The curved walls shed wind that tore across the slope in relentless sheets. Snow banked high along the northern side, but the earth-packed walls did not complain. Inside, the heater worked in cycles, not drama. Silas burned twice a day now, once before dawn, once near dusk, short, intense fires that consumed their fuel completely and left no argument behind. Heat moved outward from stone and brick in an even discipline, settling into benches, floor, and walls before releasing itself slowly back into the room. The dog claimed the bench as its own. At some point in the second week of sustained cold, Silas finally gave the animal a name. It happened without ceremony. The dog had followed him outside during a bitter morning inspection, snow caked along its whiskers, tail held level against the wind. When Silas turned and said, "Stay close, Tiller," the dog did exactly that, as if the word had always belonged to it. Tiller was lean, medium-sized, with long legs built for distance rather than speed, its wheat-colored coat now thick and weatherproof. One ear remained half-folded, giving it a perpetually attentive expression. It was not playful, but it was loyal in a quiet, working way. Ash, too, adjusted his habits. He chose to stand nearer the house now, favoring the lee side where the curve broke the wind. Silas noticed that Frost did not cling as heavily to the gelding's mane when he stood there. Animals learned faster than men. The valley began to take notice not through conversation, but through behavior. Smoke patterns changed. From Silas's house, there was little to see. Brief plumes at burn times, then nothing. From other homesteads, smoke rose continuously, thick and desperate, drifting low under the weight of cold air. Woodpiles shrank at an alarming rate. Men chopped longer hours, shoulders tight, tempers short. Children stayed closer to fires. Doors were opened less often. One night, the test arrived in full. The temperature dropped below anything the season had yet delivered. The wind sharpened, its sound changing from pressure to voice, a high, constant moan that moved across the slope and found nothing to grasp. Inside Silas's house, the air cooled gradually, predictably. He fed the evening fire, waited for the burn to complete, then closed the iron door and went to sleep without anxiety. Near midnight, there came a knock. It was not loud. It did not need to be. Silas was awake before the sound finished traveling through the structure. He pulled on his boots and opened the door into a wall of cold that bit instantly at exposed skin. A man stood there, hunched forward, breath ragged. It was Jonah Pike. Jonah was pale beneath the frost crusting his hair and eyebrows, his breath stuttering between gasps. He was in his early 20s, slender where Mercer was thick, with hands that had not yet learned to hide their shaking. His coat hung open, one glove missing. "My master," Jonah began, then stopped, swallowing hard. "Mercer's place. The roof brace failed. Snow load. We got everyone out, but—" He faltered. "The fire won't keep up. He sent me." Silas stepped aside without a word. Inside, the difference struck Jonah immediately. He stumbled one step forward and stopped, eyes unfocused as his body registered warmth where it did not expect it. Tiller approached and leaned briefly against Jonah's leg, then moved away, sensing distress without crowding it. "Sit," Silas said, guiding Jonah to the stone bench. Jonah collapsed onto it, hands braced at his sides. His shoulders slumped as heat began to return to his core. "How is this possible?" he whispered. Silas poured water, then coffee, and placed the mug into Jonah's hands. "Drink slowly." Jonah obeyed, eyes darting around the room as if looking for the trick. There was no fire burning, no roaring hearth, only stone, clay, and quiet. After Jonah steadied, Silas pulled on his coat. "Take me to Mercer." The walk was brutal. The wind cut sideways across open ground, driving snow into any seam it could find. Jonah stumbled more than once, and Silas steadied him without comment. Ash followed behind, head low, sure-footed even when drifts deepened. The night was thick with cold sound, flattened by snow and wind. Mercer's house stood dark at the edges, lamplight trembling behind rimed windows. Inside, the air was sharp with smoke and desperation. Elias Mercer sat near the hearth, his broad shoulders hunched, beard flecked with ash. His face was drawn, eyes bloodshot from smoke and fatigue. "You came," Mercer said hoarsely. Silas surveyed the room quickly. The brace had failed under load, not collapse, but enough to open gaps. Heat fled through them mercilessly. "You can't fix this tonight," Silas said. "Bring them." Mercer did not argue. Pride had been burned out of him by necessity. By morning, Mercer, Jonah, and two others were sheltered in Silas's house. Bodies lined the bench and floor, boots stacked near the wall, breath slowing as warmth did its quiet work. No one spoke much. They didn't need to. When dawn came, it revealed a valley pressed flat by cold. News traveled quickly after that, carried by necessity rather than curiosity. People came not to mock or marvel, but to stand inside and feel something they had not felt in weeks: stability. Thomas Calder arrived again, this time without challenge in his posture. He stood in silence, hat in hand, eyes tracking the lines of the house. "My north room froze solid last night," he said. "Lost a calf." Silas nodded once. "I'm sorry." Calder swallowed. "I want to know how you built this." Silas considered him, then nodded toward the foundation beneath their feet. "Start there." Others followed. Some stayed only minutes, others longer. No one laughed. That evening, after the last visitor left, Silas fed the heater and sat quietly as the fire completed its work. Tiller lay at his feet. Ash shifted outside, snow sliding off his back in soft sheets. The valley had tested the house. It had not broken. After the night the valley tested the house and failed, winter did not relent. It simply changed tactics. The cold remained, but it grew quieter, more calculating, as if watching to see what would happen next. Snow settled into permanence. Trails vanished. The valley narrowed to what could be reached on foot or by horse that knew where to place its weight. And in that narrowed world, Silas Crow's house became something it had never been intended to be, a reference point. Silas did not invite this. He woke each morning to the same routine: feed the heater, check the roofline, pack snow where drifting had thinned the berm, inspect Ash's hooves, refill the water barrel before it skinned over. He split only the wood he needed. He worked with the same restraint that had shaped the house. But people came anyway, drawn less by curiosity now than by a need to understand why one structure held when others failed. They did not come in crowds. That would have felt like spectacle. And Bitterroot was not a place for spectacle. They came one or two at a time, riding up slowly, dismounting without noise. They stepped inside, removed gloves, held their hands near their bodies as if expecting the cold to lunge at them. When it did not, they grew quiet. One of the first was a man named Walter Keene, Arthur Keene's older brother. Walter was 60 if he was a day, with a stooped posture that came from years bent over ledgers and stovetops. His beard was thin and white, trimmed close out of habit rather than care, and his eyes were sharp behind thick spectacles. He had lived his entire life indoors, but winters had still claimed things from him. His wife, years earlier, when pneumonia took hold in a house that never quite warmed through. That loss had made him cautious to the point of rigidity. Walter stood near the doorway, rubbing his hands together slowly. "Arthur says this place stays warm," he said, voice brittle with disbelief. "It does," Silas replied. Walter nodded, not trusting his own senses yet. "My house, the corners freeze. Always have." Silas gestured toward the curved wall. "No corners." Walter followed the line with his eyes, then sat carefully on the bench. After a moment, he pressed his palm flat against the stone and closed his eyes. When he opened them again, they were wet. "You didn't build this to be admired," Walter said. "No," Silas replied. "I built it to work." Word spread without exaggeration, which in Bitterroot meant it spread accurately. The house did not make miracles. It did not banish winter. It simply reduced its authority. That was enough. Silas found himself answering the same questions repeatedly. How deep was the foundation? Why the curve? Why so small a fire? Why earth against the walls? He answered plainly, without sermon or flourish. He drew diagrams in the snow, traced airflow with his hands, pointed out where heat lingered and where it did not. Some listened closely. Others nodded without understanding and left unchanged. He did not chase either. Elias Mercer returned often now, sometimes alone, sometimes with Jonah Pike, sometimes with tools in hand. Mercer spoke little, but when he did, it was with care. He ran his hands along joints, tested surfaces, watched how the structure behaved under load and cold. His skepticism had not vanished. It had matured into scrutiny. One afternoon, Mercer arrived with a man Silas had not met. The man was tall and narrow, his build more rope than muscle, with a long face and a beard that fell to his collar in a dark, untrimmed line. His eyes were pale blue and restless, scanning everything at once. He wore a battered hat and carried a roll of paper under his arm like it might escape if not watched carefully. "This is Nathaniel Brooks," Mercer said. "Surveyor, railroad man, before the line moved west." Brooks inclined his head slightly. "I measure things," he said, "and then I argue with them." Silas gestured him inside. Brooks moved through the space slowly, counting steps, tapping walls with his knuckles, crouching to examine the foundation edge where it met the earth. He unrolled his paper and sketched quickly, pencil moving with confidence. "Your curve reduces exposed surface area," he said. "Your mass holds heat. Your roof sheds load. This isn't accidental." "No," Silas agreed. Brooks looked up. "You planning to build more?" Silas shook his head. "I'm planning to get through winter." Brooks smiled faintly. "Sometimes that's how things start." The next test came not from cold, but from people. A small group gathered one afternoon at the edge of Silas's land, 4 men and a woman, their horses tied loosely, voices low but insistent. They were not hostile, but they were not deferential either. Among them was Caleb Rourke, a rancher in his mid-30s with a square jaw and a habit of setting his teeth when thinking. His beard was short and reddish, his eyes dark and tired. He had lost 2 children in infancy, both during winter, and though no one spoke of it directly, the loss had sharpened him into a man who distrusted chance. Caleb stepped forward. "We're not here to take anything," he said. "We want to understand." Silas listened. "Our houses eat wood," Caleb continued. "We can't cut fast enough. Some of us won't make it through if this keeps on." Silas nodded. "I know. We want to build something like this," Caleb said. "Not copy it outright, but learn." Silas studied their faces. Lined, weary, honest. He saw no greed there. Only calculation. "I won't build it for you," Silas said, "but I'll show you what matters." That was the moment the house stopped being just a shelter and became a witness. Silas began hosting small groups in the afternoons, never more than 3 or 4 at a time. He walked them through the foundation logic, the curve, the heater's path. He let them feel the difference between stone warmed slowly and air heated quickly. He spoke of mistakes openly, places he would improve, compromises he had made with available materials. Tiller attended every session, settling near the warmest spots, lifting his head when voices rose. Ash remained outside, patient, occasionally stamping a hoof when snow built up uncomfortably. The animals were part of the lesson whether anyone acknowledged it or not. Not everyone approved. Arthur Keene came once, stiff-backed and disapproving, ledger tucked under his arm like armor. "You're stirring expectations," he said. "People will want changes they can't afford." Silas met his gaze calmly. "People already can't afford winter." Keene frowned. "This isn't how communities work." "It's how they survive," Silas replied. Keene left unconvinced, but quieter. The real shift came when Mercer asked for help. He arrived one morning with Jonah and a piazzasante, wagon of stone. "I want to retrofit my place," Mercer said. "Not rebuild, but change what I can." Silas did not hesitate. He spent 2 days at Mercer's house, helping reconfigure the hearth, adding mass where possible, sealing gaps that had been ignored for years. It was not perfect. It would never be what Silas's house was. But when they finished, the interior held heat longer, more evenly. Mercer stood in the doorway that night, looking back at the changed space. "My brother would have liked this," he said. Silas said nothing. Winter dragged on. The house continued to do its work without complaint. The valley adjusted its thinking incrementally, the way it did everything, slowly, pragmatically, with evidence. One evening, after the last visitor had gone and the heater had finished its burn, Silas sat alone on the bench. Tiller slept at his feet. Ash shifted outside, comfortable. The wind moved over the roof in a way. Silas realized then that the house had done more than shelter him. It had revealed something the valley had forgotten. That tradition was not the same as truth, and survival was not sentimental. The building was finished. The consequences had begun. The cold that followed was not ordinary winter. It did not arrive as weather but as an event, the kind that later acquired dates and stories attached to it, the kind men referenced by saying, "That was the winter when..." Bitterroot Valley had known hard seasons before, but this one stripped away comparison. It pressed itself into memory with deliberate force, taking names, changing habits, and leaving nothing untouched. It began with stillness. The wind, which had been constant for weeks, fell away one afternoon as if it had stepped back to make room for something heavier. The air turned brittle. Sound carried too clearly. Snow underfoot squealed instead of crunching. Silas Crow recognized the signs immediately. He fed the heater early and heavier than usual, adjusting the load with care rather than urgency. Heat was not something to hoard blindly. It had to be timed. By nightfall, the temperature dropped beyond anything yet recorded that season. Lantern glass frosted from the tussaud. Inside, water stiffened in buckets within minutes. Outside, ash shifted restlessly, breath rising in thick clouds that hung longer than they should have. Silas brought him closer to the house, adding extra bedding and adjusting the windbreak. Tiller stayed near Silas's heels, alert but quiet, tail low, sensing the tension without understanding it. The house responded as it always had, slowly, deliberately, without drama. Stone absorbed, earth insulated, the curve shed what little wind returned. Inside, the air cooled but did not collapse. Silas tracked the change by feel rather than measure, adding a second burn before sleep, then sitting with his back against the bench until the heater finished its work. He didn't sleep long. Sometime before dawn, the knock came again. This one was frantic. Silas opened the door into darkness and soundless cold so sharp it stole breath outright. A man stood there barely upright, supported by another whose face was streaked with ice where sweat had frozen. Between them hung a third shape, limp and unmoving. "Help!" the standing man said hoarsely. "Please!" Silas did not ask questions. He pulled them inside, shut the door, and moved with the efficiency of someone who had practiced emergencies in his head. He laid the limp man on the bench, stripped wet layers away, and wrapped him in wool. The man was young, no more than 25, with a narrow face and fair hair plastered to his skull. His skin was pale, lips tinged blue. "Name?" Silas asked. "Matthew," the standing man said. "Matthew Hale. He fell." Silas nodded. He recognized the name. Hale worked a small spread north of the valley, stubborn and underfunded. Matthew was his youngest. Silas checked breathing. pulse, responsiveness. Weak but present. He built a careful fire, hotter than usual but controlled, timing the heat so it would not shock the body. Tiller hovered at a respectful distance, ears back, sensing danger. The second man, older, heavier, with a beard gone white at the edges, collapsed onto the floor, shaking. His name was Owen Hale, Matthew's uncle. His hands were split and bleeding where cold had bitten deep. They stayed until daylight. Matthew lived, but not without cost. 2 fingers blackened and hardened despite Silas's care. They would not recover. Owen wept quietly when he realized it. Grief and relief tangled together until they were indistinguishable. Word of that night moved faster than any before it. By noon, the valley was in crisis. Livestock froze where they stood. Chimneys failed as smoke collapsed back into rooms too cold to draw properly. Fires burned constantly but accomplished little. People gathered in the few houses that held heat longest, crowding together for shared survival. Silas didn't turn anyone away. The house filled in shifts, mothers with children, old men whose hands shook too badly to split wood, ranch hands with frostbitten ears and faces cut raw by wind. Silas organized without announcing authority, placing people where heat was strongest, rotating positions, rationing space. He spoke little, but his instructions were followed. Calm carried weight. Sarah Lindholm arrived near dusk, face hard with exhaustion. Her coat was rimmed white, braids stiff with ice. "I've got 3 families doubled up," she said. 2 more in trouble. Calder's north pasture lost power to the stove flue. Silas nodded. "We'll go." They moved through the cold like something purposeful. Silas and Sarah flanked by Ash and Tiller, lantern lights swallowed almost immediately by darkness. Calder's house was chaos, smoke trapped low, people coughing, children crying. Silas assessed quickly, opened passages, extinguished the fire, and coordinated evacuation to safer shelter. Calder protested once, then stopped when he saw his youngest child's lips turn from blue back toward pink in the cold air outside. They brought the family back to Silas's house. By the second night of the cold snap, the house held more people than it was ever meant to. Bodies layered heat, breath fogged and cleared in steady rhythm. The heater worked continuously now, fed on careful schedule, stone radiating into every corner. The structure creaked softly as temperatures outside dropped even further, but it held. Nathaniel Brooks arrived late that night, face drawn but eyes sharp even in crisis. He carried papers stuffed into his coat. "I've been measuring," he said quietly, once he caught his breath. "This cold, it's breaking records." Silas glanced at the papers. "Records don't matter," he said. "People do." Brooks nodded. "That's why I'm here. When this ends, they'll ask why some houses failed and one didn't. Someone needs to remember it correctly." Silas did not respond. He was already moving toward the heater, adjusting the load. The cold held for 4 days. When it finally loosened its grip, it did so reluctantly, like a creditor allowing delay, but not forgiveness. The valley emerged battered. Several men were lost, isolated ranchers too far to reach help, an old woman whose stove collapsed in on itself, a child who never fully warmed after exposure. Names were added to the winter quietly, without ceremony, but many lived who would not have. Silas's house had sheltered 23 people at its peak, not all at once, not comfortably, but alive. In the days that followed, the valley changed in small, unmistakable ways. Conversations shifted from if to how. People no longer asked whether Silas's building made sense. They asked where they could begin. Elias Mercer came once more, hat in hand, posture altered by humility rather than defeat. "I've been building wrong," he said. "Not badly. Just wrong for this place." Silas shook his head. "You built what you were taught." Mercer looked at the walls, the bench, the heater. "Teach me something else." Caleb Rourke returned as well, eyes hollowed by loss. Another calf, another neighbor gone, but steadier than before. "Spring," he said. "When the ground softens, I want to build." Silas met his gaze. "Then start thinking now." Even Arthur Keene came again, ledger absent this time, his hands bare. He stood quietly, observing the wear on the floor, the smoke stains that never formed. "I was wrong," Keene said finally. Silas inclined his head. That was enough. When the last guest left and the house returned to its intended quiet, Silas sat alone with Tiller at his feet and Ash shifting outside in the easing cold. The heater completed its burn and settled into warmth that would last until morning. The cold had taken names. It had not taken this house, and now the valley knew the difference. Spring did not arrive in Bitterroot Valley so much as it negotiated a ceasefire. The cold withdrew by inches, then by yards, loosening its grip reluctantly, as if offended that anyone had endured it without surrender. Snowbanks sagged and darkened. Roofs began to drip in slow, deliberate rhythms. The ground softened just enough to take a boot heel without protest. People stepped outside more often, not because it was warm, but because it was possible. Silas Crow measured the change the way he measured everything else, by consequence. Water ran where it had not before. The earth banked against his walls, settled another fraction of an inch, and stopped. The house breathed differently, releasing stored heat later in the day and cooling more gently at night. The heater's cycles shortened, wood consumption dropped, nothing dramatic happened, which to Silas meant everything was working. The valley carried its losses quietly. There were no speeches, no ceremonies beyond the necessary. Fences were repaired, livestock counted, names were spoken in kitchens and then not spoken again. What had been taken could not be argued back into being. What remained had to be protected. People began to build. They did not build replicas of Silas's house. That had never been the point. They built variations, houses that curved slightly instead of standing rigid, foundations sunk deeper than tradition recommended, hearths reshaped to hold heat rather than perform it. They borrowed what made sense and left what did not. Bitterroot had always learned that way, when forced. Caleb Rourke was the first to break ground. He chose a plot not far from Silas's place, land that sloped gently and caught morning light. Caleb was a solid man, broad through the shoulders, with a reddish beard trimmed close, and eyes that had learned to look directly at loss without blinking. The deaths of his children had changed him in ways he rarely spoke of, quieted him, made him intolerant of waste. He listened carefully now, weighing each decision as if it might cost more than money. Silas stood with him the morning the digging began, watching the shovel bite into thawing earth. "Start deeper than you think you need," Silas said. Caleb nodded. "I will." Elias Mercer oversaw the framing, hands steady, judgment sharpened by humility. He still favored straight lines where they made sense, but he no longer insisted they were the only answer. Jonah Pike worked beside him, more confident now, his earlier nervousness replaced by curiosity tempered with caution. Mercer did not correct him as often. When he did, it was with explanation rather than dismissal. Nathaniel Brooks returned as well, not to measure this time, but to observe. He carried a smaller roll of paper now, sketches rather than surveys. "People will ask what changed," he told Silas one afternoon as they watched a curved beam set into place. "They'll want a story." Silas shook his head. "Give them numbers." Brooks smiled. "Stories last longer." Silas did not argue. He had learned that endurance took many forms. Sarah Lindholm remained a constant presence. She brought supplies, coordinated labor when tempers flared, and intervened when disputes threatened progress. She had a way of standing between men without raising her voice, her posture alone enough to remind them of shared stakes. The winter had taken from her too. Cattle lost, hands injured, but it had also confirmed something she had long suspected. Survival favored cooperation over pride. One afternoon, as Silas adjusted the layout of Caleb's heater channels, Sarah watched him work in silence. "You could have charged for this," she said finally. Silas wiped clay from his hands. "Then it would have become a transaction." "And that would have been bad?" "It would have ended sooner." Sarah considered this, then nodded. "You're an inconvenient man." Silas allowed a brief smile. "So, I've been told." The dog, Tiller, had become a fixture wherever building occurred. He was leaner now, muscle hardened by constant movement, his wheat-colored coat shedding winter thickness in ragged clumps. He favored sleeping near stone and followed Silas from site to site without command. People brought scraps without being asked. Tiller accepted them politely and moved on. He had work to do, even if no one could quite define it. Ash, too, showed the marks of the season. His coat dulled, his scarred legs stiffened in the mornings. Silas adjusted his workload accordingly, letting younger horses take heavier pulls when possible. He brushed Ash carefully each evening, hands familiar with the horse's age and limits. Survival did not excuse neglect. By early summer, the valley looked different, not transformed. Bitterroot resisted that, but altered in ways that could not be reversed. Smoke rose less continuously. Wood piles shrank more slowly. Houses stood with fewer sharp edges, fewer wasted spaces where cold could hide. Arthur Keene closed his ledger one afternoon and walked the valley road instead. He stopped at Caleb's build, studied the curve, the depth of the foundation, the careful placement of stone. "We'll need new categories," he muttered. Silas happened to be there. "For what?" "For houses that make sense," Keene said. "The old ones don't fit anymore." Silas nodded. "They never really did." Keene looked at him, then away. "You didn't ask permission." Silas shrugged. "Winter doesn't." The house that had begun it all stood quietly through this, unchanged and unremarkable to those who had grown used to it. Its walls bore scuffs from boots and hands. Its bench held the marks of long occupancy. The heater carried hairline cracks from use, nothing structural, just evidence of honest work. Silas repaired what needed repairing and left the rest alone. One evening, as light stretched longer and the cold finally loosened its hold completely, the valley gathered, not for a ceremony, but for a meal. Tables were set between houses. Food was shared without counting. Children ran without coats for the first time in months, their laughter startling in its lightness. Caleb raised a cup, not to toast, but to acknowledge. "We made it," he said simply. No one argued. Later, when the crowd thinned and the stars came out, Silas returned to his house and sat on the stone bench. Tiller lay at his feet. Ash shifted outside, content. The heater was cold now, as it should be. The house held the day's warmth easily. Silas thought of the winter, not with pride, but with clarity. The valley had not been saved. It had adapted. That was enough. In the seasons that followed, the approach spread beyond Bitterroot. A rancher from the south came to look, then a family from the river country. Silas spoke when asked, demonstrated when necessary, and otherwise returned to his routines. He did not seek recognition. He did not avoid it either. He let the work speak. Years later, when people talked about the winter that changed Bitterroot, they did not speak of Silas Crow as a hero. They spoke of him as a builder, a man who understood that survival was not a matter of strength, but of attention. The house remained, low and curved against the slope, earth holding it close. It did not challenge the valley. It belonged to it. And when the wind came again, as it always would, it found nothing to take. In the end, the miracle was never the house. It was never the stones, the curved walls, or the fire that stayed warm through the night. The miracle was a man who chose to pay attention, who listened instead of fighting, who believed that even in the harshest winters, God leaves clues, quiet ones, about how we are meant to care for one another. God does not always arrive with thunder. Sometimes he arrives as patience, as wisdom passed hand to hand, as a warm place when the world turns cruel. In our own lives, we may not face snowstorms or frozen valleys, but we all face seasons that feel just as cold, moments when strength is gone, when fear feels louder than hope, and when survival depends on someone choosing not to turn away. If this story reminds you that quiet faith still matters, if it reminds you that no child, no animal, no soul should ever face fear alone, then let this story travel further. Share it with someone who needs hope today. Tell us in the comments where you are watching from. We read everyone, and if stories like this bring warmth to your heart, subscribe to this channel so we can continue sharing them together. May God bless you and your family. May he protect you in every season of life, and may you always find warmth, even when the world grows cold.